Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, which is taking a look at energy security in regional Queensland and how microgrids and community-owned energy, renewable energy, fit into this picture. My name is Jane Gaffel. I'm part of the Clean Growth Choices Consortium, and I'm hosting the webinar today. This webinar is actually the final webinar in our series and is being presented as part of the Communities in Transition program. For those of you not familiar with the program, it is a Queensland government funded program, and we're working with 6 regional communities, which are Goondiwindi, Barcaldine, Central Highlands, Charters Towers, Rockhampton and Cookshire. And these communities are exploring what the future may hold for them and the possible opportunities to help them transition into a more economic, equitable and environmentally sustainable future. The Clean Growth Choices Consortium is working alongside each community to assist them in this process and to help them to develop their own transition roadmap. So the members of the consortium are the University of Southern Queensland, James Cook University, CSIRO and the Eco-Efficiency Group. So today, next slide. So today we have 2 fantastic speakers. And each speaker will be speaking for about 15 minutes each. So we have Luke Reade from Energetic Communities and Julio Braslavsky from the CSIRO. So after their presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. And if you have any questions at any stage, just fill in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those questions during the Q&A session. So there are several issues regional Queensland are facing in terms of energy. And the main one obviously is the high cost of power. Because this is the non-contestable, most of regional Queensland is the non-contestable ergon serviced area, and the other retailers currently don't service this area. It means that there's no competition for this area. And for some businesses, this can mean power charges as high as 50 cents a kilowatt hour. Another issue could be the multiple supply charges. So for some rural properties, and a property that I visited, it was at the end of a line, so it was still connected to mains power, but because it was a large property for cattle property, it had lots of pumps to provide water for the cattle in far spread locations. And each of these pumps had its own meter and its own supply charge. And the supply charge was generally higher than the actual energy usage. Another issue for regional Queensland can be the power security, particularly for these end-of-line communities and those on particularly the single line going into their communities. And quite often there are surges along these power lines and they have brownouts and blackouts. And this can lead to a lot of problems, including just having to replace their white goods often if they can't handle these surges. And a lot of these communities are just looking for another reliable energy source. And then there are those communities, the remote and isolated communities, that are not even connected to the grid. And a lot of these already have solar, but with diesel backup, or they may be solely on diesel. And for many of these communities, they're looking for cleaner and cheaper options. So I'll introduce you to today's speakers. Luke Reade is from Energetic Communities and he holds a Master of Science in Climate Change. He's also the founder of Energetic Communities Association, which builds community-owned renewable energy, and it's also promoting a just transition. He provides policy research and advice on energy costs and financing, energy markets, consumer impacts and affordability, and climate change adaptation and mitigation as it relates to vulnerable and disadvantaged communities and households. And I'll pass on to Luke now to speak to you about community-owned renewable energy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me along and having me in today. So as Jane said, we set up Energetic Communities a couple of years ago. Our main aim is to build community energy projects. So I'm going to describe a little bit about, what is community-owned renewable energy, where it fits in, where it's occurring, and give you just a little bit of a case study on the work we've done. First of all, I can get this to progress. Yep. So first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon whose land we meet. So obviously we're all over the state. I'm in Brisbane on Meanjin, on the land of the Jagera and Turrbal people. So I acknowledge their leaders past and present and future, and to acknowledge the land that sovereignty was never ceded. One thing about acknowledgement of country in the community energy space, it's actually quite valuable and quite relevant. So a lot of isolated and Indigenous communities have really poor energy systems, expensive, poor quality housing and so on. And community energy offers a real opportunity. There's a couple of cases of it in New South Wales where communities have gone off diesel and gone into using solar. And there's a in Queensland, so the Centre for Appropriate Technology being one of them. And there's another group called the First Nations Renewable Energy Alliance. But just quickly, my story started when I went to Tvind in Denmark. So the picture you can see on the screen here, the community decided in the, I think it was in the 70s, that they didn't want to go to nuclear, so they actually built their own turbine. So you can see on the left, they were doing that. It was made from an old jet engine. They had wooden blades, and on the right there you can see the actual turbine. They just turned 40, so it's been going for some time. Been up it, it's quite scary. Homemade job. A bit rickety going up the centre, but just to show you that whole communities can come together to decide on their own energy future. So what is community energy? It's initiated and owned by the community. Often the community forms a cooperative or other such structure. The benefits flow back to the local area and investors. So by that I'm talking about the financial benefits through the investors. Generally it's people who buy locally as well, so there's a real knock-on benefit. And it provides the opportunity for all community members, not just those with the right roof, to invest in renewable energy. And now we're seeing models like solar gardens, and we're going to hear later on about microgrids and virtual power networks, where there are some models where the community can get renewable energy, even though it's not on their own roof. And obviously it builds community and social capital. So more specifically, the money stays in the community. So through the example I'm about to give, you'll see that it's local investors and there's a community development approach to it. Empowerment, so it empowers the community to decide where their energy comes from. Can lead to attitudinal change. So some people can get involved and start thinking more broadly because they can see there are solutions. Some communities are usually at placemaking. So one example I give, they have two wind turbines called Gusto, and I can't think there's another play on words, but it's now a tourism point. So there's a placemaking opportunity, demonstrates community action on climate change, more diverse investor base, so people with not so much money to invest can get involved. And capacity building, I've learned so much since setting up energetic communities. My previous existence was around climate mitigation for local government, but I've learned so much more by being involved in community energy around the technology side of it, but also the project management, community engagement, communications, etc. So in the community energy sector, we talk about the 4 Ds. So decarbonise, fairly straightforward. It's a zero or low carbon bunch of technologies. Excuse me, decentralise, so localising the energy supply and using distributed energy resources. Democratise, so it's about the community having ownership and real participation in where our energy comes from, and demonstrating not that renewable energy works, because we know it does, but demonstrates that it's what we want, and we want to see a more sustainable future and one where the economy is more balanced towards the community. So it's new systems thinking. It is a community development model. So there has been some studies done where they've looked at for every dollar committed by a local government or state government towards community energy programs, they can leverage up to $17 from community investment. And then the other side of that, or deeper than that, is the amount of money that it produces compared to other ways of doing energy. Most of that money stays in the local community, so there's an economic development. So it's not just about the environment, and it's by and for the community. Part of a global movement happening all over the world. Like much of Australian energy and climate policy, there's been a few gaps and we're a little bit behind the 8 ball, but we're rapidly catching up. And it's beyond the old system, so it's not just around the traditional economics, it's looking at how can we do things differently that actually support communities, especially regional communities. New business models are being developed all the time, and I'm going to give some examples really quickly. And as part of the new economy network, so that's the just transition model. So looking at what do we need to do separately or differently that means that we can maintain communities. So where is it? The Community Power Agency are a not-for-profit who sort of like a peak body organisation. Back in 2009, they had no projects running in Australia, but 5 groups were developing it. Come forward 10 years, we've got 150 projects in operation and 105 groups developing projects. So you can see most of them in New South Wales and Victoria. Those 2 state governments offer some pretty good programs to support community energy. So that's one thing state government could take a lesson from, is around support mechanisms. So where is it? These ones are in Victoria. The first one is MASC, the Mount Alexander Sustainability Group. So they're looking at biodiesel, looking at waste to energy. Earthworker, they're a cooperative, they're actually a manufacturing plant. So they're looking at developing, or they've bought out a solar hot water plant, and they're building solar hot water, so, you know, Australian made product, and they want to roll this out into other communities. The bottom one is Yakandanda in Victoria. They're looking at a whole bunch of things like Microgrids, but they've just received hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants to do a microgrid, community-owned microgrid. And Hepburn Wind, the poster child of community energy, 2 wind turbines, 4 megawatts. Community said no to a development, and then they got behind this and said, well, let's do it ourselves. And so they went from almost everyone saying no to almost everyone saying yes. And per turbine, they actually contribute the most to any community fund from the renewable energy sector. These are ones that are in New South Wales, so Repower Shoalhaven, we use their model, so I'll explain that in more depth later. Innova are a retailer, and Pingala in the orange there, they're a cooperative, and they're looking at cooperative platforms, so a cooperative of cooperatives. And then this one is in Denmark in Western Australia. So you can see there's lots of models in terms of both legal structures and financing, whether they're generation behind a meter or on the grid, or whether they're a retailer. And then, of course, we've just got our first project off. We're the first community energy group in Queensland to get a project off the ground. We have biannual Congress. So this is in Melbourne. This is our second one. So this is basically a meeting of the all the people working in community energy of any description. So these can be technologists, they can be financiers, they can be bankers, local government, people looking at different models. It can be energy efficiency, it could be generation, it could be trading. So it could be blockchain. So it's a really good meeting of the waters, and there's potential that we might hold the next one in Queensland, and this is put together by the Coalition for Community Energy. So what is community energy? What does it actually look like? So there's 2 kind of main models. One is called a donation model, and that's basically, as the name suggests, the community donates and solar gets installed, or any other technology. And the other one is an investment model. So the donation one, Carina, which is a citizens-owned renewable energy network Australia, they came up with this model. So basically, community members donate to Carina Fund. Then they will then provide an interest-free loan to a host site. Generally, that will be a school or a not-for-profit, but it could be a business, it could be anyone really. So they pay the solar installer, and then that host site pays them back with the difference between what they would have paid and their savings because of having the solar on the roof. As they pay back money to Carina Fund, then they use that money again for the second site, and then again they pay that back, and then the third site. So if we had a $4,000 project, that $4,000 then gets recycled to do a second one, and a third one, a fourth one, a fifth one, etc. So it's a revolving energy fund. So it's quite a good model. They're kind of estimating after around 22 projects, then they can just sort of keep rolling it out with without getting new funding. So I think they've done 28 so far, and they've got some funding for new projects as funding from old projects go towards new projects. So they've essentially got 2 sources of funding on the run. The second model is the investment model. So this is what we've just got off the ground. So I'm presenting these as though they're in succession, but a lot of these processes occur pretty much at the same time. So the first thing we do is we have a host site. So we worked with Food Connect Shed in Brisbane. We worked with them to size their system, how much energy they need, how much it was going to cost for a lease or a power purchase agreement. We use a power purchase agreement. I can explain that in a sec. And then once we've worked out the size of the system, we set up what's called a special purpose vehicle. So we went with a company, so called Energetic Communities 1 Proprietary Limited. Other community energy groups have done trusts or using co-ops. Then once we've got the funds, we then call for investors from the community. As a company, proprietary limited, unlisted, we are limited to 20 people. So however big the size of the system is, or the value of the system, you divide that by the 20 people, and that's your average investment. But some people can invest more, some people can invest less. Once we've got that money, we pay for a solar installer to install it onto the host site. And then we establish a power purchase agreement, loan or lease with the host site and the solar energy group. Power purchase agreement is just that. We have an agreement that they pay so much per kilowatt hour, and that is less than what they pay from the grid, so they make a saving. We then enter an agreement to look after it. So Energetic Communities Association, which is the original organisation I'm a member of, we basically manage the project. So we bill Food Connect quarterly, and then we give a return to investors once a year, and then we give them 1/10 of their investment. And it's 1/10 because it's over 10 years. After 10 years, we've paid back the solar, and then the investors have gotten all their money back plus their return on investment, and then the solar gets gifted to the site. So they end up, for the rest of the life of that project, they've essentially got free electricity. And of course, the investors get the return on investment, and ideally we have them as members of the association, but that's not necessary. Okay, so the project we had, this is it, Food Connect. For those who don't know, Food Connect is a social enterprise in southeast Queensland, community supported agriculture, so they pay a fair price for food to farmers. And this is just the installed solar. Interesting project itself. So we raised $62,000 for the solar. The Food Connect shed itself, the shed was being sold, so the community ended up buying it. They got 513 investors through equity crowdfunding, so pretty much a similar model to what we're doing with the solar. They pay for the power via the PPA, cheaper than getting it from the grid. They're not wasting money, they're reducing their emissions, they're adding a community benefit. And then, of course, as I mentioned, after 10 years, they own the system. The other thing to point out is, just for those who are interested, it's a 45 kilowatt system, 2 systems, and we got a donation from PowerShop, who's their retailer, and PowerShop have a particular offer where their customers can give a certain percentage that then gets used to support community energy projects. And so there's a couple of retailers that do that. Energy Locals is another one. Obviously, in regional Queensland, you don't have competition yet, but hold that thought. The interesting thing about this sector is it's very collaborative. People love to share. So there's a couple of guidance books. There's a how-to guide. There's a community energy strategy by the Coalition for Community Energy. It's up to learning about what's most appropriate for your group or your town, whether it's a cooperative or a proprietary limited, a trust, etc. Queensland didn't nationalise the laws around co-ops, so it's harder to do a co-op in Queensland than it is in Victoria or New South Wales. People love to share, so we got our legals from Repower Shoalhaven, and it works particularly well in regional communities because of the social networks that are there. So there's a couple of links there, but this will be recorded so you can grab those later. Small points can be mixed, so you can actually get projects that are both community ownership and developer-led. So there's wind farms, for example, where 10% is owned by the community. You can have a special purpose vehicle with more than one site. So it could be a school and a bakery, for example. Different legal structures, financing mechanisms and governance structures. So there's lots of different ways you can do this, and council can really step up. So Lismore City Council, for example, they've got 200 kilowatt systems. They worked out they can do it themselves cheaper, but valued their economic development model for the community, so they let the community own and run the project. And of course, you can have one or more sites with lots of different special purpose vehicles. So Repower Shoalhaven, for example, they've got 7 special purpose vehicles, but I think they're up to Project 21. And so that down the bottom there is just Rob from Food Connect Shed and Rob from Local Power, who's on our board at Energetic Communities with the delivery of the solar panels. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was very interesting. And then we'll pass on to Julio Braslavsky. So Julio is from CSIRO and he holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Newcastle. Julio is the principal research scientist with CSIRO Grids and Energy Efficiency Program. He leads a team of researchers investigating strategies for an efficient transition to safer, more secure and reliable low-emission electricity. He currently leads the research and knowledge sharing activities for the ARENA project, Advanced VPP or Virtual Power Plant, grid integration in partnership with SA Power Networks and Tesla Motors Australia. So I'll pass on to you now, Julio.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so I'd like to talk, well, thank you first of all, for inviting me to this, to share. I'm going to talk about some emerging technology options and trends for standalone power systems, which I think might be of relevance for remote communities. So, to start, one of the things that has been going around a lot in the recent couple of years is the notion of a virtual power plant. A virtual power plant is essentially an aggregation of resources, energy resources in this case, that primarily in Australia, that may be mostly PV systems, could be also wind generation, some sort of storage, such as battery storage, and controllable loads, so such as air conditioners and hot water systems. So our loads also can play a role when they are orchestrated together with battery systems and PV systems. So a virtual power plant essentially is an arrangement of an aggregation of these resources that can produce or consume energy at different times and with different possibilities to be controlled. And they're coordinated using software and communication technologies. Nowadays, we talk about the cloud. So essentially, that means through wireless communications, an aggregator can virtually make sure that all these resources in a virtual power station or power plant can provide services that traditionally were performed by a conventional power plant. So traditionally, we had electricity systems where we had very large power plants generating almost all of the energy that was consumed, and then that was transmitted to distribution grids that then will distribute that electricity to households and remote sites and commercial and industrial sites. Now, a lot has changed in the last 10 to 20 years. In Australia today, we have many systems that are generating electricity at the low end of this system. So, and those systems may be able to share, may be able to push back electricity upstream to the network. So that brings a lot of change, and our industry has been, the electricity industries have been trying to adapt to these changes. And so new technologies have been appearing and being developed, and essentially are enabling us to actually coordinate some of these distributed systems and resources to deliver those services such as balance of supply and demand, So being able to generate enough electricity when it's required, and as well curtail demand if there is not enough supply at some point, and doing that in a smart way. And also make sure that some standards of power quality are met, as well as providing contingency services when there are faults. So in brief, that's a virtual power station could be just an arrangement of households where each household has some loads that were some appliances that will consume power, such as air conditioning or hot water systems, lighting, and they could also have a battery, or they could be a shared battery, a community battery. So the way to make all of this work is to be, it requires some software, and it requires some communications to make sure that all these devices are doing the role at the right time, and the battery is charged when there's enough, there's availability of resource. For example, solar. And I have a little cartoon here illustrating how a day of a virtual power plant may work, where, well, now we are at in the evening time, households will mostly be using electricity that has been stored during the day. Or it may, if it's grid connected, so it's connected to the grid, it may be using cheaper electricity at nighttime. During the day, we'll try and use renewable energy to charge the batteries, the storage systems, and provide, once those batteries are charged, it will be able to supply electricity for other purposes to the rest of the grid, or may be able to provide some services such as regulating power quality. So that's there's other technologies that are not just generation or storage or communications. One of them is this cloud forecasting technology that was developed, we developed here in CSIRO. So the idea of a cloud forecasting is essentially a camera that will look at the sky, and it will try and identify clouds and track their movement. And that's very important in a remote site where there's no connection to the grid, because you most likely, these sites will be running on diesel generators. And if we are facing a cloudy day or a partially cloudy day, it's probably safer to leave those generators running, although we may have quite a bit of solar resource during the day. So this system, the cloud forecasting, will allow us to ramp down gently the solar generation and enable the diesel generators to ramp up in a gentle way to be ready when the clouds actually hit the solar panels. So that actually has a potential to save a lot of diesel in remote communities, and has applications for solar with generator, without battery, or solar with storage to optimize the operation of the battery. Also to be able to do with a smaller battery than otherwise one would need, but by improving its utilization. And it has also applications in normal rooftop solar or solar plus the grid. So the way it works, here's a little demonstration showing what the camera sees. We see on the left-hand side, like a fisheye camera, shows the sun. And you can see on the border of the circle that's here in our site, you can see some of the clouds that are moving from the horizon. And on the right-hand side, you see the same picture, but this time overlay with the detection of clouds that may be on the way of the sun. So if I run this I can run this again. Maybe not. Okay, here we go. So you will see some red detection, and that's when the clouds are actually are moving in the direction of the sun. And that's how we can actually, by tracking those clouds, we can predict any drops in power generation 15 to 30 minutes ahead. And that allow us to ramp up diesel generator in a gentle way, and also ramp down solar generator, the solar generation, to provide better power quality and avoid blackouts. Here's a little bit of the economics that we gather by using data in a remote site, at the very far north in WIPA, that's a mines site. What this plot is showing is essentially what is called a Pareto Fran. It's a curve that balances gainings in accuracy in forecast on the vertical axis. So on the left-hand side, we move into the best accuracy in forecasting, while on the right-hand side going down, that's how much fuel savings we can provide. Now you can see these are different ways of running the system. So for example, the three cases illustrated here say that about in the left-hand side, the legend on the left-hand side, we can provide 100% accuracy, but the fuel savings are very modest, just at 20%. And this is run over a 12-month period. If we can relax a little bit on the forecast accuracy, meaning sometimes we will get it wrong with the prediction, we can get more fuel saving. And there's another case illustrated on the right-hand side where just by dropping to 95% accuracy, which means we will get it right 95% of the time, the fuel savings can be up to 41%. So these are simulations that show that it's possible to tune to different applications, and there's significant opportunity for fuel savings by mounting this technology on top of existing solar and battery systems. There was an interesting piece of news last week in the ABC. People may be familiar with the fact check run by RMIT University and the ABC. So they use that for the Q&A session, the Q&A program on Mondays. So there was a tweet by Malcolm Turnbull where he put forward the bottom line for renewables and storage, that they are cheaper than new coal, let alone loopy current fat of nuclear power, which is the current weapon of mass destruction for the backbench. Okay, so the fact check at RMIT actually did put together all the facts, and well, the the result is that the verdict is that this is a fair call. So actually, under current policy and economic condition, it is actually cheaper to produce electricity from wind or solar sources than it would be by using new coal or nuclear plant, with or without storage. Here's a brief representation of some of the work that has been done by our economic team here in CSIRO. And you can see how there's a range, of course, because all of these are predictions in the future, with different assumptions. And so there is a range, there's a more or less conservative prediction. Solar photovoltaic with no storage, and this is what is the cost of generating electricity. So around $50 per megawatt hour. And then you can see all the different technologies with storage. For instance, when you add 6 hours of pump hydro, what's the range of costings that will be for generating electricity from those sources? It's now around $110 per megawatt hour. And you can see also wind here. And in comparison, you can see black coal and brown coal. And there's two options here. One is when one assumes there's no risk imposed by climate change. But now, as it turns out, there's a lot of risk, and you will need to get to pay big insurance premiums for building a new coal-fired power station that will last 30 years in the future. And those insurance costs are the ones that are raising the cost of electricity supply from new coal, new conventional power station. So here you can see the difference between putting no risk or putting a 5% risk premium in both black coal and brown coal. So based on this, nuclear is far away, much more expensive than any of this. So these are results from the a recent study on the generation costs from our economic team here in Newcastle. Well, the cost of PV generation is been going down in the last almost 10 years. I remember when I put 1 kilowatt of solar panels on my place in 2009, and now with the same money, I could put many more solar panels on top of my roof. You can see here, this is solar trends from Solar Choice, residential solar PV price index that they generate. And the way in the future is going to continue going down. Here are some projections from our economic team here in CSIRO Newcastle from a research report. Basically what this shows, this graph on the right-hand side, is that by 2030, solar systems are projected to cost in a fast change scenario 55% less than today, or 45% with a neutral, sort of less, as a neutral change scenario, or the most conservative scenario will be a third less than cost today. In terms of battery storage, these are the projections, the similar projections for systems that include small-scale solar with batteries, and these are the costs of solar per cost for kilowatt of solar energy. And here goes from 2020, $2,900. For this is, you can see how these systems costs are reducing significantly. So we expect to have by 2025 about 75% of the 2020 cost, and by 2030, so this is only in a decade ahead, we expect them to be half the price of next year. So what this means is a lot of change for everybody connected or not connected to the electricity grid. There has been a recent change of rules that are very significant in Australia that allow now anyone to actually go off grid and be off grid and in the same condition. So there were rules before that would not allow people to go off grid or have restrictions, but now the Australian Energy Market Commission has sorry has been running a project bringing these changes online, and essentially is trying to bring the benefits of lower prices for battery storage, PV generation, and other technologies for orchestrating these resources consumers, especially for those that could be off grid or are in very remote section of the grid. And this is traveling north. This is something that I found that this has very recently been moved into a trial at Daintree, where the Australian Energy Market Commission, together with the Queensland government, are supporting this trial in Daintree. So there's a lot of information. For those that are interested, could look at the recording later on following this information. You can find them in the Australian Energy Market Commission site. Now, what is actually driving this rule change? I will try and explain it by looking at the economics of distributing energy. So I have a curve here that plots the cost of supplying electricity according to the density of customers where you're supplying it. So measure as customers per kilometer. So on the left-hand side at the bottom, we have very low densities. That's very remote sites, very sparse density of customers for the grid. And on the right-hand side, we have very dense urban communities, typically highly dense supplying to customers in cities. Now, at the moment, we have a flat price for supplying electricity. So everybody pays essentially the same. And that somehow is, and that is subsidizing those that are at the remote end of the grid. So everybody pays the same flat price for to getting electricity supply to be on the grid. Now, overlay here. Now I have the cost of supplying electricity off grid. And it's interesting to see that if you are this customer at this point, there's no incentive for anyone connected to the grid to actually go off grid, because it will cost more to actually go off grid. So you will have to pay more. So no one who's grid connected and is below the red line will invest in trying to go off grid from the customer point of view, or from the consumer point of view. On the other hand, there are some consumers that are, if they are connected at a very remote part of the grid, there will be significant savings from moving off grid and then just being off grid. But of course, from the consumer's point of view, if they are paying the flat tariff that everybody else is paying, there's no incentive either to move off grid. However, from the point of view of the supply, from the operator of that network, there is significant incentive to try and move those people off grid and providing them with the means to be off grid, because it will cost them cheaper than maintaining a very long, shaky line to supply a very remote site. So you can see that there will be savings by getting all of these people in the red-pink area moving off grid from the point of view of the utility. On top of this, because batteries and PV generation are dropping in price, it means that the cost of off-grid supplies is also going down. So those benefits are making this group of off-grid consumers larger, which means it's possible to offer to more people that are in remote part of the grid all the means to actually be off-grid And that will make economic sense from the point of view of the utility. And that's essentially, so this is the incentive issue that is highlighted in this AEMC document that is cited here. So, and essentially, the more people, the more we can take, the more customers we can take off grid in this pink area, or that the utility can, that is supplying these remote areas can take off grid, it will actually mean that they could potentially lower for everybody else the price paid for on-grid supply. So it's really a case of a win-win situation here. So even in the absence of federal energy policies, you can see how technology is actually driving this transition, these changes. So there are actually some trials that have been run in Western Australia. That's one of the utilities that's been at the forefront of pushing these changes. And in this trial, the findings are that they had for customers in a community where they disconnected them from the grid, and they have given them standalone power systems. So standalone meaning that they are not connected to the grid. They have their own batteries, PV generation, and backup generation. They found that the costs are 50% less than neighbors that are still grid connected, with only 5 hours without power, as opposed to 70 hours without power as their neighbors, with 90% of the energy coming from solar, where for the neighbors are still 90% of the energy coming from fossil fuels. So this is a clear case where there are some communities where very clearly they will be much better off being off grid, and it will be cheaper actually for the utility to give them the technologies to do so. Now, more of this is expected to happen in the future. Here at CSIRO, we have done a long view study called the Electricity Network Transformation Roadmap, where we projected what's going to happen to our electricity networks up until 2050. Here we have some of the results by 2027, which is less than a decade ahead. And the findings are that there are potentially 100 billion savings for the whole industry, including the consumers, by adopting a more decarbonized, more distributed, and more disconnected system. So with this type of technologies, we will have a network that will run better, and it will be cleaner, and actually it will be actually cheaper to run it in that way. So this will require also communication technologies and coordination technologies that are being developed right now. But we are right now at the point where we start to see these changes actually happening and becoming economically, making sense economically. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julio. That was very interesting. I was particularly interested to see that the cost of batteries will be 75% of what they are now in just 5 years. So that's really that's really good. Now, if anyone would like to ask a question, you can just add your questions into the Q&A section. And we haven't got anyone brave enough to ask a question yet, but I did have one for Luke. So if you can just put the question into the Q&A section and we'll ask those questions. Luke, how would a community or council start a community energy project?
Yeah, so some of the key things are to just get a small group of people. It kind of needs one person to drive, one or two people to really drive it. Get a small committee of people, try to have someone a bunch of people who know, have a set of skills. So on our committee, our management committee, we have a couple of local power, sorry, that's the name of the org, but the local solar installers. We have someone who's got some IT expertise. We have a pro bono lawyer in Sean Thomas Lawyers. We have people who used to work for council as heading off the greenhouse team. We have someone else who's doing large-scale solar, and then people involved in engagement. A couple of people on this call actually have been on our management committee, so people who are studying the social impact of community energy. So having a bunch of people who have those skills and then approach the different sites, have that conversation around what it might look like for them. And then we can share with any communities who are interested, we can share our constitution. As I mentioned, we got our legal documents from Repower Shoalhaven. We paid for them, but you can include that in your costings. So they ended up through government programs getting lawyers to help them sort of write up those agreements. So that's like the power purchase agreements, any memorandums of understanding, documents to the offer document to say to prospective investors how much they can expect. So all of those sorts of things you do need a lawyer to have a look at to make sure it's all your noughts and crosses are, can't remember the cliche right now, but dot your I's, cross your T's. And so it does take a bit of work. Local government can fund projects. So Sunny Coast Solar, for example, they got some money from their local government. And offering brews. So Lismore, for example, they've got a waste facility and a sports centre that they have 100 kilowatts on that they offered up to community energy. And then the city's power partnership from the Climate Council, they have a whole bunch of things in there around reducing emissions, but they support community solar. The other thing is to have a chat to the Community Power Agency, who do a lot of the policy developments, and they have some templates. And another one is Frontier Economics or Frontier Impact. They have a solar toolkit, and they actually have a spreadsheet. So if you don't have a solar installer on your management committee, they have a free template that you can whack in all your assumptions, have a look at the bills and what the demand is, etc. So you can come up with both a price for a PPA, or how much you might want to lease the solar for, or how much you might want to lease a roof to have the solar on. So it allows you to have the different types of economic or financing mechanisms.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's excellent. Thanks, Luke. We've got a question from Anthony here for Julio. Which networks currently subsidise the cost of off-grid DER in fringe of grid and remote areas?
So as far as I know, for sure, Western Power in Western Australia, and we just having this trial run in Daintree. That from what I know, this is very recent. There's also a case in Beulah in Queensland. I'm not too sure. This probably would be Ergon supplying this town. I know that they also have a standalone system from what I read in the AEMC site. So it's something very recent. In Western Australia, obviously they have many standalone systems. So they are the ones that have been pushing this change in the rules most strongly.
Excellent. And the follow-up question, do networks own the assets, or is there any model for community ownership or transfer of assets over time?
So from what I know, the cases that I know, the utility still owns the assets. I know one trial from Horizon Power, also in Western Australia, where they made an arrangement with a commercial consumer. So the consumer, they bought a battery system, and then Horizon Power bought another, doubling the storage capacity. So pretty much that was a shared arrangement. I'm not sure what the case is in Daintree,